So we have built this simple form. Now we want to add validation to it. In Angular, we have a class called form control. For each input field in our form, we need to create an instance of the control class. And with this control class, we can check the current value stored in an input field. We can see if the input field has been touched or untouched. We can see if it's dirty, which means its value is changed, or pristine, which means its value is not changed, whether it's valid or not, and if it's not, what are the validation errors. So for each input field in the form, we need a control object. Now, similar to the control class, we have another class called form group, which represents a group of controls in a form. Each form is essentially a control group because it contains at least one control. But in a complex application, you might have a form with multiple control groups. For example, you might have a control group for the shipping address and another for the billing address. Now, interestingly, all the properties of the control class that you saw earlier are also available in the form group class as well. So we can ask a form group if it's valid or not. And that returns true if all the controls in that group are valid. Similarly, we can get all the validation errors in that group. So accessing these properties of a form group is easier than iterating over all the controls in that group and checking their status. So to add validation to a form, we need to create a form group object for the form and a form control object for each input field in the form. This way, we can keep track of the state of each input field and the entire form as a whole. Now, there are two ways to create these control objects. One way is by applying some directives in our template, and Angular will create these control objects for us implicitly under the hood. We call forms that are built this way template-driven forms. So we build them using their template. Another approach involves explicitly creating these control objects. So in our components, we should write code to create new instances of the control group and control objects. We call forms that are built this way as reactive forms. Previously, they used to be called model-driven forms. Now they are called reactive forms. Now you might ask, what is the difference? What is the difference between template-driven forms and reactive forms? The difference is that when we create these control objects explicitly, we have more control over their validation logic. So if you want to build a complex form with complex validation, you need to use reactive forms. You need to create these control objects explicitly. And also, another benefit of this approach is that you can unit test the validation logic of your form. Otherwise, if you want to build a simple form with some basic validation, like making some fields required or within a given range, then you can use template-driven forms. So template-driven forms are easier to create. We write less code, but we have also less control over the validation of our form. Now, in this section, we're going to look at template-driven forms, and we'll leave reactive forms to the next section.